I thought firstly we would just have a look at the general area of the area that we're talking about today. But here we are in the general area of Iran, Iraq, Israel and ISIS. And I thought we'd just consider a little bit of those general areas first. Because I think if we were asked, what's Iraq? What do we have to do with Iraq? Who could sketch it on a piece of paper? And what goes in Iraq? I think most of us would say, well, we see it in the paper all the time, but actually describe it and describe what goes on in Iraq and its different regions would probably be quite a different thing. For most of us, I think. Some would certainly know all the wrinkles of it. But the largest Arabian country, of course, is Saudi Arabia, which is a very large country. And above that, we've got Iraq, which is obviously a formulation made up by the British and the French after World War I. And then off to the west of that, we have the country of Syria, which too was divided up by the same two powers after World War I. So Iraq's not a very large country in size, nor in population, about 25 million. But to the eastern side of that is the country of Iran, and that's a much larger country in every consideration. It's 65 million. It's self-supplying as far as food and many other things are concerned. And what is so different about Iran in the whole picture is that it is a Shiite country, almost exclusively, and it also is a very gainful country. You don't find virtually a product in the world from most Arab countries, do you? If you were to say, what do you buy from Arab countries after oil, you'd be going to make a story. But Iran's a different place. It makes not only all kinds of things, and there's many, many factories which were developed by the Tsars in their turn, but it also is into highly developed warfare technology today. Iran is a significant country and it's wealthy. Iraq is, it does have Shiites, and they're mostly in the south of Iraq. And that big section on the north-eastern side is the area of the Kurds. It has autonomy to some degree, but it's, of course, Muslim as well. And then off to the south of that is the large section which is the Iraqi Sunni area. So it's sort of in three blocks, Iraq. It's quite a confusion. Syria is a country of something like 30 million people, and of course, as we know, it's torn in all kinds of ways in the current situation. So that's Syria and Iraq and Iran, and Israel, of course, is there just as a tiny little spot right in the middle of all that conglomeration and confusion. And prospering. 7 million people in Israel today, it's prospering, whereas the others are full of turbulence and disarray. There's a more detailed map of the area of Iraq to show those three basic designations. You might remember about 20 years ago that Iran and Iraq had a war that went on for about 8 years. And it so wore out their men folk that eventually they were down to boys of 10 and 12 running up with weapons against each other. It was a disaster, absolute disaster. But it shows, doesn't it, that there's tremendous feelings between those countries in the past, even if in the current mood they are somewhat working together. The whole Arabian world has been, in my lifetime, an area of great turbulence and disarray. And Iraq really symbolises that very thing. What is this Shiite-Sunni controversy that so affects all of those Arabian and Muslim countries? Well, it goes right back 1,300 years. When Muhammad died in 632, there was debate as to who should take over after him. And some said it should be of his bloodline. Others said, no, we want the right man. We should be voting him as the Muslim fraternity make their decision based on the qualities of the man involved. So that's the difference between the two. The Sunnis, they said that it should be a person that is in the line of Muhammad, his own fleshly inheritance. And the Shiites said, no, we want to choose a man that has got the abilities. Well, isn't that an amazing thing? That's 1,300 years ago. So how much a controversy, my dear brothers, unsolved, can throw its effects through mankind, through countries. 1,300 years they've been fighting that issue. And does it really matter that much? Surely the important thing is that the person that's there is able to do the job. And if not, if it's by inheritance, then you put someone there who can help to do the job. And other kingdoms have worked like that. Many kingdoms have worked like that. But not so in the Arab world. That controversy is as strong today, if in fact it isn't stronger than it ever has been in history. What an amazing thing. You know, of the children of Ishmael, it was said that they would be a diverse group. An ass man is really the Hebrew sense of the description. Every man against his fellow. How remarkable has this statement become? It's a feature, and everyone recognises all around the world that is a feature of the children that have come from that position. Every country in that area, including Saudi Arabia, though that's mostly Sunni, all of them have got some of the other. Even if Saudi Arabia is, say, 90% Sunni, yet nevertheless it has an element of Shiite existence. And if Iran is 90% Shiite, yet there's a percentage of Sunnis also in Iraq. So every country is divided, in that whole region is divided between that very large controversy, that very long-standing controversy that's gone all that time. Well, what's the story of ISIS then? It was horrifying the world, wasn't it, for quite some time. What is the story about ISIS? Well, it really arose in Syria. Syria had a president whose name was Assad, and he was a very cruel and evil man. That when he went off the scene, his son came along, and people hoped that it might be some improvement to the circumstances. But Assad number 2 was no better than his father. He turned out to be a man of great cruelty and wickedness. And he wasn't past bombing his own people to get his own way in his own country. I think that the figure's now up to something like 2,500 people that he has by his own Syrian guns killed his own people. And so he was despised in the world. Peculiar, the thing that was very significant that's brought the matter on is that Russia, in fact, supported him. And you and I would probably think, well, he wouldn't be supporting him if it wasn't in the interests of Russia. And of course, that was what his interest was. But it just shows you the price that the Russian leader is prepared to pay if it means some advancement to his own Russian power and control. So there were rebels, therefore, in his country that hated what their president was doing. And those rebels then started to divide into all different groups. Al-Qaeda was one of them. And in the milieu of all of that, various rebel groups doing all sorts of things, and Assad still bombing away at his own people, they felt that they were winning, but of course the rebels themselves were divided. It was a hopeless situation. So a more radical group again rose to the surface in Syria, and they were called ISIS. And it's gone by different names, IS and ISL and IS. We'll just call it ISIS this afternoon. Very radical, exceedingly radical. Radical in the sense that it wants to bring a form of Islamic following into the country, but more than the country, to the whole of the Mohammedan world. This leader is a man called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It's pretty hard to remember those long names, isn't it? But let's say it again. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The al-Baghdadi's got to do with Baghdad, as you might guess. Not that he necessarily comes from Baghdad, but there's a reason why he puts that on the end of his name. And the reason is this, that when Muhammad died, the person that took over from him was called Abu Bakr. And he had the al-Baghdadi on his name as well. So what this man is doing in our lifetime is trying to take up the role of Abu Bakr in the days of Muhammad. He succeeded Muhammad, and his success was remarkable, historic really. Within 10 years, the Mohammedan cause had spread from Pakistan in the east right through to Morocco in the east. If you in your mind's eye can imagine that, that's a phenomenal achievement, isn't it? Hence, this man, relatively unknown to all of the world, certainly in our countries, he suddenly was touting himself as someone that was going to bring all of the Arabs together, and they would have a leader, which they call a caliph. The Arab world had been without a leader, and they had been in that way since 1924. And he established himself in some degree of leadership in a place in Syria called Raqqa. Raqqa really suited him because everything was in a mess. And so a cause that had a very clear focus and clear leadership could do a lot in that country before it was really prevented from its ways, because everything else was just so ragged and distraught with division. So in 2014, in July the 1st, 2014, he crowned himself, as it were, as the caliph of all Mohammedans in the world. Now, given what we just saw in looking at those countries, and we only saw a piece of it really, it was an enormous call, wasn't it? For a man to suddenly, well, we couldn't spell his name. Nobody'd heard about him. Suddenly he's made himself to be the supreme Muslim leader over the conquered territory in Syria, and also now, because he was just running across the border into Iraq, and he was making rapid progress through Iraq and declaring himself that he was the leader of Mohammedanism throughout the world. There was tremendous fear of him. It seemed that that was his means of promoting his cause. He was known for things that nobody ever really had done in the modern world, like opponents were just shot dead in front of the photographers, or they were beheaded, and all the gory scene was portrayed to the Western press, and all the Arabian press as well. Or in fact, some of them were crucified. He'd line up 25 men along the shore of the lake, and he'd shoot each one of them in turn, and they're all dressed up in blind and so on. That went on to the screens of the Western world and the world generally, and it horrified the world. But if you were localised to him, that would already really put the wind up you, wouldn't it? What are you going to do with a system like that? And so because of that, people were fleeing, and therefore ISIS grew at a rate that we'd never seen anything expand as quickly as that. So ISIS, therefore, was a very great concern. And a lot of folk believe that it could be the turning point in the Arab world, and that it could go on from there and be very, very great indeed. There's some reasons, though, some very basic reasons why I don't think that could ever really have happened. ISIS had no government. It had no capital city. It had no organisation of government. It had no financial security. It had no planned economy. It made nothing. It manufactured nothing. It had no king. It had no military training. So those basics really logically meant that ISIS, for all of the fear it might portray to others in the world, was really not going to go a long way. And I emphasise that because we probably know that in Christadelphia the last 40, 50 years, there has been from time to time the suggestion that Gog would actually be from Arabian people, from Arab peoples. And there's been times when that's been almost a quite popular belief in certain areas of our brotherhood. But my dear brothers, that isn't the biblical picture. And ISIS comes well and truly short because it has none of those basic qualities that are needed for a strong and modern nation. Just looking at Iraq again, you can see really that it's made up of the fertile and the infertile. Those yellow areas are very barren indeed, extremely. Then we have two rivers, the river Tigris, which is the more northern one, and the river Euphrates. Why such two large rivers in a fairly small country? Well, both of them find their water from the northeastern hills, mountains, really 9,000 feet high, of Turkey. It's a lot to let go out of your boundaries, isn't it? But those two rivers have been flowing with tremendous strength for all those years, until eventually, towards the Persian Gulf, they joined together in what's called the Shat al-Arab. It's almost like a huge channel of water. Sometimes it gets to be almost 50 miles wide as it empties into the Persian Gulf. So Iraq is really a country of two rivers. And in between the two, Mesopotamia, there is a very, very wealthy piece of ground, extremely fertile. The Lord Jesus Christ speaks about putting in a seed, and he says some 30-fold, some 60-fold, some 90, some 100-fold. But I read about this section of Iraq that on the flats of the Euphrates, they can have something like 400 or 600-fold increase from the one seed. Even New Zealand would find that difficult to match, wouldn't you? That's amazing fertility, colossal fertility. And it helps us to realise why Iraq's it's a mess, but on the other hand, it still seems to perpetuate itself and to feed its public. It's a very interesting country indeed. How interesting do you think it is? There's not a person here today that doesn't have roots back to the area of Iraq. That's why we read this afternoon from Genesis chapter 2. Because the two rivers are mentioned there in Genesis chapter 2. It's where Adam and Eve were brought into life. The Garden of Eden was there. Where all the trouble and the mess of Iraq, the fact is, all mankind has arisen from that piece of ground. That's where Abraham came from. He was in Ur of the Chaldees, and that's situate on the Euphratean River. It's a great capital city of the past and has had a huge influence upon the world. The head of gold, as Daniel was told it was. It's the capital too of the Empire of Assyria, because Nineveh on the Tigris River was also, of course, in Iraq. It's a very significant piece of country, isn't it? Much more than perhaps we would have thought at first. It's very significant. From the Mohammedan point of view, it's significant because not only is it sort of in the centre of the Mohammedan world, you might say, but Baghdad, which is also on the Tigris River, was the centre of the caliphate for many centuries of years. And that's why this Abu Bakr wanted to move in that direction, the direction of Baghdad, because situated in the 50 miles around Baghdad, there are many remarkable mosques. I mean, remarkable buildings. And when the battle gets close there, you might notice that over the last few years, when the battle gets close to Baghdad, it really gets on, doesn't it? And everybody really gets into it, because a lot is at count when it comes to the area around Baghdad. So Baghdad means a lot to the Muslim faith, and some of the greatest mosques in the world are around it. And that's why he called himself, his last bit is al-Baghdadi, because obviously that's where he wanted to set up his headquarters. That's why he called himself like that. That's why the one who succeeded Muhammad, that's why he did the same. So there's a background there in Iraq, which is extremely interesting to us. But coming forward now, what happened then to this caliphate that was situated in Baghdad? Well, you might remember in World War I, at the end of that war, Turkey, that had backed the wrong horse, they were in quite a quandary as to where their country was really going to go, because they threw their lot in with Germany, and at the end of the war, Germany had lost the cause, and of course Turkey suffered considerably from that. And it wasn't until 1922 and 1924, in that period of time, that Turkey started to sort of unravel herself and say, well, where are we going? And they didn't know how really to form a government, because it had been a great empire. It had spread its empire right through the north of Africa, right out to Morocco, and even into Spain, as we know, and on the east, equally as far. Now it was just a country, back within its own borders, and they were really troubled as to how they would run the place. And so they looked for the only man really that they had that might signify leadership, and that was a man called Ataturk, Emel Ataturk. He was the one that was responsible for the Turkish victory at Gallipoli. So he had a track record of considerable significance, and that appealed to a desperate people. But Ataturk had seen before in his life what happened when the religion, when the church, as it were, was in control also of the state. And he didn't want that. So he said to them, I'm prepared, he said, to be the leader of Turkey, and it's just Turkey now. I'm prepared to be the leader, but it's got to be a secular state. It's got to be run by the state, not by the church or by Mohammedanism. They said, we'll take that deal. And so Ataturk became the leader of Turkey because of that. But remember, that means we've got no caliphate. We've got no head. We've got no leader for the Turkish people. If you turn to Revelation chapter 9, I used to find it really interesting when we first looked at Revelation 9 and the history of the Arab peoples as to why it was that a people that just had a nomadic existence before that time, how was it that they could suddenly run over all of those countries? It is a fascination, isn't it? But if you think of other circumstances in history, perhaps within our own times, it's not an unusual thing, really. Give a country a brilliant leader, and it's just a different thing altogether, what they can do with that country as to when it hasn't got a leader. And in Revelation 9, it says in verse 1, the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven, and the earth, and to him from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. It was given, a star fall from heaven. And it's interpreted really in the last verse of that fifth angel's proclamation, where it says in verse 11, they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. They had a king over them, and that king was given them by God. In other words, God gave them leadership. Muhammad was a leader. As much as we might deprecate what he had to say, nevertheless, he was an outstanding leader to be able to do what he did. But that particular quality that he had was a God-given quality. Lord God raiseth up men over men, does whomsoever he will. Daniel says that, chapter 4, verse 17. Here's a classic case in point. Mohammedanism was not a mistake in the world. It was something that God directed because he wanted to bring his judgment upon a very apostate church. A Christian church that has now turned to idols and all kinds of evil things, as delineated in the latter part of that chapter, this chapter which is dealing with Mohammedanism. Now, isn't that interesting? I think that's really interesting, because that's the secret of the story. You can learn all about the history and geography of Iran and Iraq and all these other countries, and if you didn't know that, you'd still never understand what it was all about. But the record of the scriptures tells us that that's what it was about. So all of these things were very much related to Iraq, which is a very significant country. I just thought I'd show you a little bit about the River Euphrates. That's it coming down from the hill country in the northeast of Turkey. It's a beautiful river, isn't it? Very, very beautiful river. I suppose New Zealanders don't appreciate rivers like we do in South Australia, but it is a very beautiful river, I tell you. And it gets very wide. Here we've got down to the flats, and you can see the lower reaches of the Euphrates are really something very special. And it's always the same. There's always water there. And they've been irrigating it for scores and scores of years. Now there's two references in this Revelation 9 and Revelation 16 to the River Euphrates in the book of Revelation. And since we've got Revelation 9 open already, let's have a little look at that. It says in Revelation 9 and verse 13 that the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. The result, the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year for to slay the third part of men. So there we have an expansion of the river Euphrates, which, as you can see, is like a principal river that's running through that key area, Turkey down into Iraq. Turkey supplying the water, as it were, and Iraq using the water that came from there. And this whole chapter is about the Mohammedan explosion. You might think, well, that's a bit of an assumption. But you know what's interesting? If you were to look up all the commentaries that have been made about Revelation 9, right back to the third, or rather to the 9th and the 10th and 13th and 14th and 15th and so on, centuries, you'll find they all got this right. We have a little book called A More Sure Word of Prophecy. You might have seen it. If you look that little book up, you'll see how correct that is. There's been all kinds of commentary on Revelation. And it is an astounding thing, my dear brothers and sisters, that most of them got our understanding of Daniel and of Revelation pretty right, which is quite amazing. It's the end of the story in the kingdom of God where they go wrong. But it's astounding to see how much commentators in the past looked at, say, Daniel chapter 2 and got it exactly right. 4 kingdoms and so on, just like you get in your Sunday school lesson. Well, it's really fascinating to see when it comes to Revelation chapter 9, they all got it right. Because Revelation 9 is a very unique chapter, and it doesn't fit anything, does it? It's completely different to any other chapter in the Bible. But it fits one set of circumstances in a brilliant way, a very brilliant way. And everybody got Revelation 9. So when I say the River Euphrates is referring to the explosion of the Mohammedan cause, it's not just a Christadelphian statement. Every commentary, really, in history, until the 19th century, had the same understanding. That's interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. If you come to chapter 16, in chapter 16 we have a second reference to the river Euphrates. It's in verse 12. And the sixth angel, this is the vials now leading up to our times, the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates. And it's the opposite effect. The water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. I'm not going into the detail of that, but I'm just wanting to make the point that if in chapter 9 the river Euphrates was a diagrammatic representation of the Turkish Muslim power, if in chapter 9 that's there by common agreement, then we can be assured that verse 12 is speaking of the same power. That's a very good way to come at that whole subject, isn't it? My dear brothers and sisters, the world is not going to be taken over by Mohammedans. They had their time, and that was back in the 7th century and from then on. But it is not so in the latter days. The latter days sees the river Euphrates hemmed in, brought back into its banks. Put the two of them together and you've got a very comforting, I suppose, in many ways, very comforting understanding that it's not going to be by ISIS or by any other Mohammedan cause that the world's going to be taken over. What can we say about ISIS? We can certainly say that it's very greatly agitated the world, hasn't it? We've felt it ourselves, the horror of the things which they will do, and not only that, but they don't do it behind a sheet or in the midst of the forest. They do it right out there with the public eye, with the cameras focused upon what they're doing. The most gruesome and wicked ways. Okay. But it's not going to be a Mohammedan takeover. It's not going to be an Arab go. It's not so designated scripturally. So we can be quite sure that they're not going to run the course that Ezekiel, for example, describes for us. A little reference here might be very helpful. This man, Joseph Mead, wrote in the 17th century, which of course is well before the eclipse of the Turkish Empire, which happened, as we said, in World War I. It was the final eclipse, really, of all the territory that it used to occupy before. But this man's writing a couple of hundred years before that. And commenting on Revelation 16 verse 12, he said, "Why should not now this Euphrates, by the same reason as in chapter 9, be understood of the Turks, that is, the Muslims?" Well, it's as clean shot as that. Simple argument by Mead 200 years before he ever knew that the Turkish Empire was going to be mopped up. That's what he said, and he was right. Well, I want us just to come to a chapter we know so well. Ezekiel chapter 38. I'm just picking out 5 points, my dear brothers and sisters, as a summary of all the things that are contained there. What are the issues of this remarkable chapter? 1, it's a great confederacy and it comes from the north. It says that specifically in chapter 38 and verse 7, and it says it even more emphatically in verse 15. It is a great confederacy that comes from the north. The time is designated clearly. When my people of Israel dwell safely And that's emphasised in those three verses, verse 8, verse 11 and verse 14. Don't miss it. It's repeated 3 times that that's the situation. Do you know, we have missed that. We've been loath to really bring that into our understanding of Ezekiel 38. I say loath, I think we have been, haven't we? You wouldn't hear too much about it. It was a bit of embarrassment to us because Israel didn't seem to be dwelling safely. And there wasn't a peace around Israel. And I can remember in many debates in earlier years in my own group at home that we would say, no, we've got to stick it out until there is peace in that land. That's what the record says, and it will come. How? We did not know how it would come. It's the most unlikely thing. Go back to all those 50s and 60s and 70s. Or when there were 20,000 Russians in Egypt. Seemed anything like peace in the Middle East from Russia. We had to wait, and now we are seeing the picture is blooming in front of our eyes. And amazingly, Israel seems to be believing it themselves. Next thing is that it says in verse 3 that it's an evil thought that comes to its mind. Now, that's the way the prophet put it. It implies, doesn't it, that before this time it didn't really have that thought. An evil thought comes, which means that prior to that it wasn't really necessarily how they felt. I think that's very interesting. Because it is quite clear from a lot of the things that Mr. Putin has been saying, and I don't want to invade on Paul's address in the next session, but it's obvious that he does have some personal reasons, and he's expressed it publicly, as to why he has a feeling of good towards Israel, because they were good to him in his youth. And we're seeing all sorts of remarkable things in the last just 3 or 4, 6 months perhaps, where Russia's been involved in the land and making all kinds of propositions to Israel. So the evil thought may well be something that arises and is perhaps arising from time to time, but it might be until that time that Russia really is quite happy to talk to Netanyahu and discuss this and that about world affairs, in particular the oil of the Middle East. The next great thing is that it's an invasion, and it's not like any other invasion. This is the real thing. This is Armageddon. It's a cloud to cover the land. Scripture doesn't use that terminology in such a way as Ezekiel 38 describes it. There's lots of wars mentioned in the Bible. There's nothing like that. This is the battle of all. It's a cloud to cover the land. It's a decision made in the grandest way, the largest way. It's not a sidestepping of issue. It's the very central thing that is mentioned in Ezekiel, and it's such a thing that in the end the nations of the earth, by means of this, are going to recognise that God is God in all the earth. The outcome, therefore, verse 5, God glorified by many nations. Now you've got that picture in mind. There's the facts. From the north, Israel will dwell safely. There's an evil thought of the northern invader. It's an enormous invasion. And the outcome is clear. And God is glorified. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, there's Isis. A straggly bit of territory that's been strung together in bits and pieces all over the countries of Iraq and Syria, just as opportunity might have it. Nothing like what Ezekiel's talking about, whatever is it. Nothing in the world like it. There's no comparison whatsoever. It's not going to be from there that the designation of Ezekiel 38 will be found. In contrast to that, here's the picture that is the real picture. A vast splash of earth, of red, right from the centre of Europe right through to the fringe of Asia. An enormous piece of work. An enormous area of land. That fits it. A cloud to cover the land. Indeed it does. And interestingly, it has a sort of caution about it in this, that it's not all in the north, is it? This power has so planned things that it's got friends in the south as well, because there's Libya in red, and Ethiopia in red, and there's south even of Egypt. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? We have to wait to see that those things actually will happen. It might not be that we have to wait personally, but that's what will happen. When it moves, finally, they are under her control. So's Iran. Persia's there in red. She's under the control. She doesn't think she is today. I heard that Russia used one of her bases for flights over Syria, for bombing flights over Syria, and used an Iranian base. And 2 days later I heard that Iran kicked her out, and I somewhat believe it. I don't know if anyone else has got the same record, but I thought, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Iran's not a takeover. She's got a very independent mind indeed. But all of that is what Ezekiel's speaking about. It's not some other cause that's going to come unsuspectingly to us. Well, what about the peace matter then, my dear brothers and sisters? How do we understand that could possibly come about? Well, we're speaking about Iran and Iraq and Syria and Israel. And Putin has good relationships with all of them. If you went back 5 years ago, it was vastly different. 3 years ago, 2 years ago. But today, even Israel is silly enough to get herself involved with agreements with Gog. There's no question that we have the right understanding of these circumstances. The peace is being developed in the most interesting manner before our eyes. Russia is on friendly terms with all of them. Now, how could you be on friendly terms with a country that destroyed 2,500 of its citizens by just turning its bombs straight at its citizens? How could you be at peace with that country? What's the mind of a country that could do that? How can he even think to do that? Well, do you think he really cares? Look what he did to the Chechens who were part of his country. The more Chechens who were killed when they bombed the cities out of existence than they ever were killed in Syria. So what would Putin think of that? How could he make a plan of peace with Iran that's despised almost by every country in the world because of its behaviour? Well, because if it's in his advantage, Russia's advantage, he doesn't care. He's almost immoral. But the same man can also do a deal with Iraq, and seems to be almost as effective in Iraq as the US, after all that she did for Iraq in 2 wars, and both Bush presidencies featured wars on behalf of Iraq. And now who's in there? Well, Russia's in there as much as America's in there, that's for sure. But the thing that really hurts is to see that Israel too is involved in her hands. It was only just a couple of weeks ago, in fact it was only a week ago, wasn't it, that Netanyahu from Israel was in Moscow, and Abbas from the West Bank has been invited to join with them in Moscow to resolve the problem of Israel, her territory, and the city of Jerusalem. How intriguing is that, my dear brothers and sisters? I find that really almost agonising. Here's a little piece that brings that together. in the Australian paper, 25th of August. It's very recent. President Vladimir Putin is pushing to host peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians in the latest sign of his ambition to replace the US as the chief power broker in the Middle East. Mr. Putin told heads of state in the Arab League that talks over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must focus on creating an independent, viable and integral Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. How's the demand of this man, the cheek of the man? Do you know, they've always had tremendous interest in Jerusalem. You'll find, when you're in Jerusalem today, you'll find sections of quite the centre of Jerusalem, where the Russians had her interest for many, many years, centuries of time. And one of those we'll show in just a minute. But another aspect of this man is this, that he's actually portraying himself as the conqueror, as the victor, the hero of Christianity. A man that's backed Iran, a man that's backed Syria, a man that has seen such spoil of his own people in Chechnya, yet champions the cause of Christians all through the Middle East, and they follow him. My dear brothers and sisters, that's an incredible achievement, isn't it? How did he ever paint himself in that way? How did people ever believe that? Well, this is just a portrayal here. Christians living under siege in Iraq in latest outbreak of Islamic strife are so disillusioned with the West that they are appealing to President Vladimir Putin to help with the establishment of an independent Assyrian Christian state in northern Iraq. There was 1.5 million Christians in that area. Isn't that an amazing turnaround? You would never ever think that Putin would be able to do such things as that. But he's an exceedingly adept person indeed. I find a great deal of intrigue in this photo here, my dear brothers and sisters, because if you can see that clearly enough, you'll see there's a little bit of green right in the very centre, and that's Israel. If you were in occupation of all that rest of the red, north and south, would you really be worried about the little bit of green? The tiny bit that represents, well, it's the only piece in the world of which God has given a title deed to a people. Australians don't own Australia. We've got no title. New Zealand is the same. No one, no country in the world's got a title to the ground that they occupy. There's one country only. And this power is intent on planting its importance in that very territory and has its eye upon it. Well, we'd understand, wouldn't we, that Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish have to come into the picture. But what in fact has happened is it's just been words, nothing really much more. Occasionally there might be some exercises, but generally speaking, it's been nothing more much than words. Some of the famous words were, "I will not be putting a foot into Iraq," so said President Obama. But Sheba and Dedan virtually takes up Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf states and so on that are related to that. It is interesting to see that there has to be a king of the south, because Ezekiel's depicting that. Ezekiel's depiction is really fascinating, isn't it? He not only describes this northern confederacy, but he also does describe something which was southern. Daniel will speak about the king of the north and the king of the south, and that's fairly easy to read. But Ezekiel's got the same picture, hasn't he? Because he's saying there's Sheba and Dedan, which are south, and the merchants of Tarshish, which have always traded with these southern countries, and they'll be opposed. They will not be involved in the confederacy that comes from the north. So it's really the same picture as Daniel, just different terminology. Well, it's interesting in 100 ways in the last several months to see things happening that we've never dreamt would happen. Whoever thought that Saudi Arabia would be lining up like that? Saudi Defence Forces move into Yemen. It's not just to Yemen. They're really on the go. They've awoken, as it were, to the options that are before them. Here's Saudi men by the score with new tanks, new artillery and new planes. But of course linked up with America. So the old relationship is coming back as it was in earlier times. And they're very active. You know, when the largest military exercises ever in the world took place, with hardly a word in our press, it was in, I think, the month of March. And in the northern section of Saudi Arabia, only just, 100 miles from the Persian Gulf, there was an exercise that involved some 27 countries. Staggering, isn't it? From Morocco to Pakistan. They were all in it. Anything, I suppose, that was Sunni. Gathering together in northern Saudi Arabia in phenomenal numbers of soldiers. 30,000 soldiers were involved. There was planes galore and every other form of equipment. And it was called and directed by none other than Saudi Arabia using the US. And did you hear about that before? It's hardly in our papers. Yet it'd be one of the greatest military exercises ever. But the King of the South is certainly awake to the potential, even if he's not prepared to really do much more than say a few words. And I think this is interesting too. Brother Don had some very fascinating things to say about Brexit and so on. Well, this is a depiction of the British Commonwealth. Is there anything like it in the world? There isn't, is there? There's been many European countries that have occupied a country here or there in the rest of the world, but nothing like that. 48 countries at one time were under the British flag. And obviously they'll be looking to restore something of the relationship which they had with Britain in earlier times. And it just comes into the world at this moment that Brexit happens to provide this opportunity for all of these potential members, Sheba and Dedom and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof, and there they are. And suddenly they have a real new position in the world and would be looking to restore their earlier relationships. How fascinating is that? Both Cairo and Washington are moving to strengthen partnership and cooperation in the fight against terrorism. That's Cairo. So Egypt's in it as well. Washington wants Egypt to achieve real success against the extremist organisation in the Sinai. The US has transferred without cost 762 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. These are designed to protect soldiers from landmines and other forms of explosive devices. This is another step in the general increase in the US-Egypt military defence. There have been variations, hasn't there, in recent years about the relationship of the US to Egypt, but that's the current trend. I think this is terribly interesting. It's an old shot, isn't it? Russia's interest in Jerusalem has always been there, and I was moved to see that when she spoke about talking about a plan of peace for Israel and the Palestinians, she had the gall to say, and East Jerusalem is the capital of the Palestinian people. She's had her eye on Jerusalem for many a long time. And in this one that we have, it's the Russian quadrangle that's got this big long wall around it. You've probably seen it if you've been to Israel. And this tower goes right up in the centre of it. It's a very high tower indeed. Why do you think they need a tower like that? What are they looking down on? This is what they're looking down on. Jerusalem. The best advantage point in the whole of that land of Jerusalem is the Russian tower in the Russian quadrangle just east on the Mount of Olives where our Lord left. What a cheek is that? An evil design, an evil thought will come into thy mind. They got the best view in the whole world of those circumstances. I want to finish with a remarkable article which occurred in the Australian just a week or so ago. It really is an amazing article. We're going to read it together. This week, Russian bombers flew out of Iranian air bases. Iranian air bases. Never anything like that ever before. To attack rebel positions in Syria. The State Department pretended not to be surprised. It should be. It should be alarmed. Iran's intensely nationalistic revolutionary regime had never permitted foreign forces to operate from its soil until now. There's a photo there of the Russian plane letting its bombs off over Syria as having come originally from Iranian airfield. The reordering of the Middle East is proceeding apace, where for 40 years the US-Egypt alliance anchored the region. A Russian-Iran condominium is now dictating events. That's what you get after 8 years of US retrenchment and withdrawal. That's what results from the nuclear deal with Iran, the evacuation of Iraq, and utter US immobility on Syria. This is a very brilliant US correspondent that's really having a crack at his own country as he sees it. Iran, the nuclear deal was supposed to begin a rapprochement between Washington and Tehran. Instead, it has solidified a strategic military alliance between Moscow and Tehran. He's right, isn't he? Did Ezekiel mention Tehran? He certainly did. Persia's in it. With the lifting of sanctions and the normalising of Iran's international relations, Russia rushed in with major deals, including the shipment of S-300 ground-to-air missiles they never had before. Russian use of Iranian bases now marks a new level of cooperation and joint power projection. My dear brothers and sisters, how close are we to the end? Phenomenal, really, isn't it? Phenomenal what's happening. What about Iraq? These bombing runs cross Iraqi airspace. Two Bush governments wanted to put their foot on Iraq and make it something of the Western world. These bombings run across Iraqi airspace. Before President Obama's withdrawal from Iraq, that could not have happened. The resulting vacuum has not only created a corridor for Russian bombing, it has gradually allowed a hard-won post-Saddam Iraq to slip into Iran's orbit. According to a Baghdad-based US military spokesman, there are 100,000 Shiite militia fighters operating inside Iraq, 80% of them Iranian-backed. That's a sensational comment. Syria, when Russia dramatically intervened last year, establishing air bases and launching a savage bombing campaign, Obama did nothing. Just words. Art thou come? Indeed, he smugly predicted that Vladimir Putin had entered a quagmire. Some quagmire. Bashar al-Assad's regime is not only saved, it encircled Aleppo and has seized the upper hand in the civil war in Syria. Meanwhile, our hapless Secretary of State is running around trying to sue for peace, offering to share intelligence and legitimise Russian intervention, if only Putin will promise to conquer gently. Consider what Putin has achieved. Dealt a very weak hand, a Russian state, short of empire and saddled with a backward economy and a rusting military, he has restored Russia to great power status. Reduced to irrelevance in the 1990s, it is now a force to be reckoned with. In Europe, Putin has unilaterally redrawn the map. His annexation of Crimea will not be reversed. The Europeans are eager to throw off the few sanctions they grudgingly imposed on Russia. And the rape of eastern Ukraine continues. 10,000 have already died. 10,000 already have died. And now Putin is threatening even more open warfare. Under the absurd pretext of Ukrainian terrorism in Crimea, reminiscent of Hitler's claim that he invaded Poland in response to a Polish border incursion, that's exactly what Putin is doing to the Ukraine at the present time? Exactly. Putin has threatened retaliation, massed troops in 8 locations in the Ukrainian border, ordered Black Sea naval exercises, moved advanced anti-aircraft batteries into Crimea, giving Moscow control over much of the Ukrainian airspace. State Department spokesman, 400 million payment to Iran was leverage to assure prisoner release. In other words, always negotiating from a terribly weak position. State Department spokesman John Kirby told reporters on August the 18th that negotiators had deliberately leveraged Iran's desire to get a 400 million payment from a decades-old arms deal to ensure authorities would not renege on freeing 3 Americans in January. Don't win wars like that, do you? And why shouldn't he? Putin's pushing on an open door. It's not hard to open an open door, is it? You don't have to push hard at all. He's pushing on an open door. Obama still refuses to send Ukraine even defensive weapons. The administration's response to these provocations? Urging both sides to exercise restraint. Both sides, mind you. And in a gratuitous flaunting of its newly expanded reach, Russia will be conducting joint naval exercises with China in the South China Sea. That's above New Zealand. It's above Australia. Russian-Chinese exercises under common leadership. We're in the thick of it too. Dwelling heedlessly in the Southern Ocean, but now we have joint naval exercises of Russia and China in the South China Sea, in obvious support of Beijing's territorial claims and illegal military bases. Yet, says the brilliant writer, yet the President shows little concern. He is too smart not to understand geopolitics. He simply doesn't care, in part because his priorities are domestic, in part because he thinks we lack clean hands and have thus the moral standing to continue to play international arbiter. I wonder how clean he thinks are the hands of Putin. Well, my dear brothers and sisters, we can go on with loads of that, can't we? But that's an American writer of some perception telling us how close we are to all of those things. Shall we conclude with this very different and yet very beautiful statement? It's from Elpis Israel in 1850. I don't think, my dear brothers and sisters, we know what we've got. Really, I don't think I do. I tremble to read these words, and I think, where have we got away from some of the basic pioneer approach of our early brothers? How is it that everything seems to be on the move away from where we were? How is it that we've allowed that to happen? It's not easy to stop it, is it? I know it isn't. I know from my own ecclesia, from my own area, from my own country. I know it's not easy. But you know, we were really given a fantastic start, weren't we? What about this for a slice of remarkable comment? In 1850, he didn't have all these quotations that I've got here. The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. The Russian autocracy, in its plenitude and on the verge of its dissolution, is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing upon the mountains of Israel, looking through the eyes of that tower, eh? Lord of Jerusalem they'll be. They'll set up their headquarters there. Daniel tells us that. Ready to be smitten by the stone. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, its grand move, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand. The long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel, our Lord Jesus, will be on the eve of becoming a fact. And salvation will be to those who not only look for it, but have trimmed their lamps by believing the gospel of the kingdom unto the obedience of faith, and the perfection thereof in fruits meet for repentance. Thank you.
BibleTruthandProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthandProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthandProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.